Beep, 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 beep. I found the most marvellous Substack. So I'm going to share it with you. It's a review of Hannah Barnes' book, Time to Think, which, as we know, is the Amazon #1 bestseller. It was picked as the Times Book of the Week, I believe, or whatever it is that authors do. And it's been written by a guy called Matt Osborne. So thank you very much for this, Matt. I've reshared it on my Substack. And Matt begins by saying, when Bernard and Terry Reid, the founders of GIRES, GIRES, lobbied for parents to have faster access to drugs and surgeries to sterilise their gender non-conforming children in 1997, they put suicide risk at the centre of their argument, 1997. Now, you'll remember recently, I put up a conference thing with 1999 on it, and we had Dyke magazine from 1977. We've known about this a long time. Go back further, you've got Stoller, Benjamin, Money, de Chegley, and then Bernard and Terry Reid. Okay? Unless children receive puberty blockers on demand, they claimed, suicide was inevitable. There's the genesis of this idea that has led to so much harm. The lie. The Reids presented no evidence for this claim. Indeed, no one ever has, because the trans suicide myth is purely a form of emotional blackmail. It has zero validity. Suicide rates amongst trans kids are the same as other gender non-conforming kids, and when such a tragic event does happen, it can be at any stage of the transition. In other words, hormones and surgeries are categorically ruled out as a cure for trans suicide. Otherwise, suicide rates would go down. In fact, our best long-term study out of Sweden suggests suicidality can be 19 times higher in the adult population of transition people. That's reason enough alone to stop it completely. Reason enough to stop it completely. But facts be damned, because the child sterilising cult was never about facts. It was always been about desires, the childish desire of children, the adult's desire of adults, and the false promise of a magic pill to solve all the problems. Terry Reid maintained that opponents of sterilising prepubescent children are hoping that during puberty, the natural hormones themselves will act on the brain to cure these trans teenagers, reframing the adolescent stage of the human life cycle as a form of conversion. We can't let these special kids grow up in the normal way human children did for 230,000 years, otherwise they will die, because reasons. So went the argument, not from the clinicians, but from the would-be consumers. Susie Green, now former CEO of Mermaids, is better known today than the Reids or their organisation. The Reids were also members of WPATH, an organisation of endocrine quacks that changed its name to assume the identity of a medical gold standard of care. It has been a remarkably successful scam, a British iteration of the American frontier tent revival and patent medicine show. Got some snake oil, I said you. Together with another lobby organisation called Gender Intelligence, a constellation of Munchausen parents and transgender crusaders became a sort of mafia, subtly threatening parents and clinicians into playing along with the belief in gendered beingness and its supposed risks. Nice kids, aren't they? Would be a pity if something happened to them. Blackmail. In her new book about the scandal which unfolded at Tavistock, Time to Think, BBC Newsnight reporter Hannah Barnes does not refer to the community which spawned the scandal as a cult. Here at the distance, however, we understand that the trans child is only a modern take on the ancient phenomenon of esoteric sanctified children. And now Barnes has become a star witness in our case that the trans child is a cult. Indigo Kids. And it's the Indigo Kids. Now, Hannah Barnes has produced a brilliant book, but doesn't address the cultural phenomenon. But all these things that we're seeing happening, we do a bit of that here. We can put the things together. Far from giving children time to think as they have been sold to the public, puberty blockers are the absolute end of all thinking. I'd say social transition is the end of all thinking. In the words of Dr. Hilary Cass, trans identity became the panacea for a cluster of unrelated problems: depression, anxiety, autism, same-sex attraction, homophobia, abuse history, attachment through diagnostic overshadowing. Salvation in a singular explanation, a convenient escape for family and social pressures by way of sterilising drugs and surgeries. The emerging cult believed in the trans child with patently religious fervour. Gendered beingness was more real to them than a child's body. Any number of children could be sacrificed on this holy altar of gender identity. Creating the godchildren has been a goal in itself for this blinkered ideology. Their bodies are the tablets on which the new transhumanist faith has been inscribed. As Barnes acknowledges, pediatric transition is a faith project. Doctors are not sure about any of this. Contrary to the pronouncements of the cult, the science is not settled, and this field of healthcare is overpopulated with small, poor quality studies. Barnes writes, "It is often not possible to draw definitive conclusions on the benefits or harms of these treatments. No one has ever done any real science to prove the trans child exists, because it doesn't. What happened at Tavistock was anti-science. More than 1,000 children were referred to GIDS and hundreds of them treated without any follow-up until the very end, almost any data collection. Nevertheless, in time, the clinicians knew that something was wrong. Despite the idea that blockers were being administered to provide children and families with more time to think, it was becoming clear that they were all thinking in exactly the same way. The ideological capture here at the heart of this. Another profitable monolithic explanation for children's distress had come along and finally won the market. The trans child enjoyed growing political potency and social status, a cult becoming a culture." Brilliantly written by Matt Osborne here. Culture war was always a stated objective of the cult. During a 2017 interview with the National Lottery, director Polly Carmichael, head of the Tavistock Clinic, said that the mermaid's approach is more aligned to the American model than the Dutch model, which had started the pediatric transition fad. Although she could not be bothered to share critical information, Carmichael reportedly wrote staff memoranda on post-structuralist ideas, postmodernist, high-level theoretical ideas and stuff. Likewise, a former assistant director of the GIDS at Tavistock told Barnes that from its inception, the programme was a justice project as well as a therapeutic project, for it aspired to widen the circle of people whose experience of the self is listened to with respect. The term justice-based approach is from the revolutionary language of the American left, in which lived experience replaces objective evidence. Experience of the self is the language of self-help, pseudo-therapeutic woo. Money played a big role in the development of the transgender cult, but belief was the most powerful force. According to whistleblower Dr. David Bell, a clique grew up inside of Tavistock GIDS that embraced belief in the trans child and impressed it on others in the organisation, using transphobe as a term of abuse to bring people into ritual alignment. Bell says they've swallowed the ideology that's edgy, for the clinic was seen as being the greatest thing we have. Conformity became a culture, and no doubt could be allowed. Trans kids exist on faith alone, and by faith in them alone are we saved. Dr. Sue Evans, who saw undue influence of patient support groups on GIDS clinical practice, following the advice of mermaids, they stopped including birth names on clinical letters. Another GIDS staffer saw the workplace become really political, with the Dutch model treated as a competitor rather than a guide, and mermaids pushing for ever faster resort to puberty blockers. This place needs shutting down, doesn't it? Barnes writes that pressure groups and service users whose focus was on the need to modify the body agitated for the earliest possible interventions. Staff observed Carmichael bending over backwards to try and please Susie Green, the then head of mermaids. During this time, staff pointed out that, for example, boys subject to puberty blockade during TANA stage 2 of their development will never develop enough penile tissue to form a neo-vagina, requiring gruesome procedures using part of the child's colon. A pamphlet was prepared, approved by the suggesting surgeon, and then tabled by Polly Carmichael. After all, Susie Green had her own son Jackie put through the exact regimen, bragging in a now-deleted TED talk that he had little to work with as a result of the puberty blocker installed at 11 years old. In the same presentation, Green flatly admits that her husband's homophobia drove her decision to sterilise and castrate Jackie. On these two issues, Especially sensitive to Susie Green, Polly Carmichael lacked the courage to risk offending her, leaving patients and families without proper knowledge of what lay ahead. Informed consent was a cruel joke. Almost every child put on puberty blockers was locked into their new identity, proceeding to cross-sex hormones and surgical interventions, traipsing merrily along a dubious path. Everyone knew something was wrong, but nobody stopped. Evidence from within GIDS itself showed blockers weren't providing time and space to think and reflect, as they had been told, and as they had been telling children and their families. Barnes writes, some young people's health appeared to deteriorate while on the medication, and yet almost no one stopped the treatment. As the social contagion of the trans child spurred new demand, far outpacing available appointment, Will Crouch found Tavistock was crazily busy, and he soon felt like a gatekeeper to puberty blockers. Rather than children in confusion and needing time to think, he encountered a fundamentalist mindset. Frame of mind. If you can imagine you're talking to somebody who's saying, this is what I believe, and you're sort of invited to disagree with them, and if you question in any way, then you're a bigot or you don't understand. By the time they showed up at GIDS, their views were often so deeply entrenched as to what needed to happen, largely puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, that doing any kind of exploratory work became extremely difficult. Whereas the Tavistock was famous for emphasising talk therapy, GIDS has become a factory where caseworkers handle more than 100 patients at a time. So many new staff were hired that it became impossible to challenge the business model. In the words of Anastatis Spiliadis, all training came on the job, new hires being paired with more experienced clinicians. As new hires eventually came to understand what was happening, however, turnover meant the loss of institutional memory and the ability to identify problems. Questioners left, believers stayed. It is an objective fact that young people are not good at stopping and thinking before they act out. Craving status, the young seek it through absurd and often dangerous actions. Social media has monetized the dopamine thrill of status with the likes and followers, but the kids have not really changed. What has changed are the medical and therapeutic professions, which created the new market for medicalized teen angst. What has changed are trans YouTubers coaching children in how to say the right things to get puberty blockers and begin their glorious gender journey into iatrogenic harm. Osteoporosis, cancer, heart failure, diabetes, and the manifold health risks of treating puberty as a disease. During a series of international meetings in 2004, Dutch and American clinicians pressured Royal Medical Institutions to provide puberty blockers to children under 16. Dr. Richard Green, an adult gender medicine specialist, held a rival conference to the Royal Society of Medicine in 2008 in protest of its age limits on puberty blockers. The pressure worked. That year, blockers were made available to children as young as 12 at the Tavistock. You ghouls. Ghouls! Public inquiry, arrests. It would be too much to call this a medical experiment, since there was no effort to record the results, much less make them scientific. Attempts to strengthen GIDS methodology in 2010 failed because GIDS leadership did not think children would agree to a randomised trial. They knew their market and what that market demanded. Lived experience trumps reality, folks. This is me now for a second because I'm fed up reading it. Right? Lived experience trumps reality. As evidenced by the internal report from Dr. David Taylor, which languished for 15 years. They held on to it. Kids were not even sure whether they were treating kids' distress at being transgender or identifying as transgender because they were feeling distressed. Puberty blockers were held out as the cure-all for the distressed child or family, but they resolved nothing. As Hannah Barnes explains, GIDS used only one self-reported metric of success, self-satisfaction. Yet their own data showed increases in suicidal ideation, self-harm, negative body image, and the mental health in children under 16. They knew the damage this was doing. They knew. It's worth remembering that the original study protocol had stated that an improvement in mental state and overall well-being will support the view that the treatment is effective. Barnes writes, by the author's own measure then, the early blocking of puberty in these young people was not found to be an effective treatment. Money now provided momentum, as 21.8% of the income of the Portman and Tavistock Trust was coming through GIDS. Being a monopoly provider in the NHS England healthcare system, the clinic had no incentive to pause, like they were repeatedly advised to do. Many children and families found the question of staff pathologising, so the normal talking cure method at Tavistock went by the wayside. You can't talk about it, you just got to accept what the child says. It's their lived experience, it's their reality, it's their gendered soul. Comorbid mental health issues were unaddressed. Clear cases of abuse were reported, including fabricated or induced illness, formerly known as Munchausen's by proxy. Clinicians were overruled and these children were approved for puberty blockers anyway. Children presented with transracial identities and were given puberty blockers. Anna Hutchinson wanted a child taken off the blockers after a mental health crisis and a suicide attempt. It was a mess. They were so lacking in ability to function that they couldn't attend appointments with us, Hutchinson says, concluding that what Gids did was mad. Recalling this time at Gids, Crouch theorises that organisation helping a certain group of people will develop symptoms that are related to the work that they do. At Tavistock, one of those symptoms was homophobia. Gender dysphoria has always been understood as temporary in most cases, the most boys simply being gay as adults. 100% in the Dutch study. According to former staff, themselves homosexual, heterosexual colleagues did not seem to understand that lesbian, gay and bisexual youth often display extreme gender nonconformity. Discussions of sexuality were actively discouraged. Gids was institutionally homophobic, in the words of one witness. Far too many families, puberty blockers and sex change were conversion therapy for gay kids. Staff witnessed daily homophobia from parents who referred to a trans girl to a gay boy or a trans boy to a lesbian girl. Children internalise these attitudes. According to research that has been available since the 1980s, LGBT children are impacted by gender dysphoria at a much higher rate, with some 90% of trans-identified females being same-sex attracted or bisexual, and 80.8% of males. Of the 33 females involved in the original Dutch study, all were lesbian or bisexual, and only one of the males was heterosexual. Barnes interviews former Tavistock patients who fit the bill. No test exists to know which children will persist in a cross-sex identity and ones which will abandon it. Once the transgender explanation takes over, the only thing that matters is transition. By medicalising all of the trans children, Gid was doing permanent harm to children who would otherwise grow up to be happy and healthy, gay and lesbian and bisexual adults. LGBT children are being desexed by the cult of the trans child. Difficult questions on this topic met with hostility in staff meetings, where words like vagina and sex bodies were deemed transphobic, and children were at best were to be described as assigned to sex at birth in order to obfuscate reality. The influence of the culture outside the clinic was clear. Between June 2016 and February 2017, 11% of children coming into Gids identified as non-binary. Homosexuality and gender nonconformity had been repathologized for profit. Profitable new identities were under discursive constructing by language. More than half of the children referred for blockers showed clear signs of autism or ADHD, but no diagnosis was offered, and no further investigation took place. Executive staff explicitly included autism and other vulnerable populations in the marketing. We have carefully extended our programme to offer physical intervention to those who have a range of psychosocial and psychiatric difficulties, including young people with autism and learning disabilities and young people who are looked after, i.e. in foster care. Despite claims to the contrary, Barnes used Gids receipts to show that children receive puberty blockers in as few as 2 appointments, sometimes 3 or 4, rather than the 5 or 6 that had been the supposed standard. After listening to heartbroken clinicians, most of whom would only meet him off-site for fear of retaliation, Dr. David Bell cited pressure within the institution to not think, deplored the pressure to process referrals quickly, and objected to the climate of fear in what was meant to be a care setting. The reception that Bell's report received from Carmichael's office, and then the bitter denials her office made when the report was leaked to the press, were typical of their approach. Governors of Tavistock were consistently blocked from seeing staff interview transcripts, reporting problems to leadership. Internal reports were buried. A siege mentality took over. Tavistock head Paul Jenkins was still calling puberty blockers reversible on BBC Radio 4 long after everyone in the clinic knew it was false. Gay children. Too much was at stake for the normal rules of evidence to apply. I have been struck by the fact that no one speaking favourably of Gids has been willing to put their name to their comments, Barnes notes. Thanks to a still vital press, including BBC Newsnight, Tavistock did not escape scrutiny. A formal review by the National Safety Regulator gave them the lowest possible rating, and the GIDS is now closing. Dr. Hilary Cass proposes to replace it with regional centres focused on the actual cause of distress rather than offering one patent medicine panacea for all childhood distress. No child will be able to receive puberty blockade without being part of a proper study protocol. Actual science is now required. Adults have intervened at last. However, other than Susie Green, who was apparently forced out for being terrible to her own staff, no one has been punished. Some number of children has irrefutably been harmed. Kids were medicated who did not need the medicine and it's harmed them. We only await an understanding of how many. As Barnes explains, what evidence exists from the Tavistock experiment shows that detransition is real. So far, the only survey of this population shows that health concern and an adult mind, but not some nebulous transphobia, are the chief reasons for desistance. Anyone who spent a little time in the gender trenches will know that denial runs deep. The trans child cult does not want to admit that detransition exists. Forced to acknowledge them at all, the activist explains the detransitioner away. This population is marginalised within their former community, treated as apostates of the cult. Gender nonconformity has always existed. Past cultures have accommodated this trait, even sacralised it. But now a global cult of the trans child frames itself as emancipation for these children based on ambiguous, low-quality evidence that puberty blockers are a magic cure for every form of social or personal distress in a youngster. Hannah Barnes has written a highly readable account of a very complex disaster. Her prose is littered with evidence of the role that faith played in all of it. Those of us contending with this Gnostic confession must recognise it for what it is and call it out, for we cannot be obliged to share in the magical beliefs of other people, even if they are popular. Well, what can I say? Matt, thank you. That is an extraordinary article. And I think it clearly lays out what Barnes has discovered and what we also know in the cultural sphere, that essentially gay, lesbian, autistic, looked after kids, those with learning disabilities, have been preyed upon by a voracious industry run by ideologues who need to go to jail. But we still need to get it out of schools, universities, the police, the courts. It's got to get out of everywhere. It has to go. It has to go. Thank you very much for listening. I know this is longer than normal, but I felt it was an important article, and this would be a way for you to find it. I'll see you later.